Yeah. So I think let's start, Jerry. Yeah. So I have the pleasure to introduce to you Jerry Brown. He is an anthropologist and former activist, or maybe present activist, who served as a founding professor of anthropology at the International University in Miami. And in the conversations that we had, we also found that we had common books that we read and theories that we know. And one of them is Victor Turner. So, is there, just for a start, do you think that Victor Turner had some way of understanding the meaning of experience in ritual culture? Jerry, what do you think?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I was delighted that you knew of Victor Turner, my professor from Manchester, England, my professor of symbolic anthropology at Cornell University. And I was fascinated with his work because I found him to be the only anthropologist or sociologist who studied anti-structure, marginality, liminality, what happened beyond the boundaries of structure. And from that particular, and he used that as a way to examine rites of passage, that people would start out in everyday social structure. They'd go through a separation process that could involve all sorts of purification ritual. And then they would be in a liminal state, as he called it, betwixt and between, out of time and space, neither young nor old, neither child nor warrior. And then they would reintegrate into society, usually at a higher status. And in one perspective, one could think of the mystical experience, which is so central to religion, so central to psychedelics. And as my wife, Julie, and I were fascinated to learn, so central to the healing process, because the Johns Hopkins and NYU studies of psilocybin with advanced cancer patients found, and I'm quoting now, paraphrasing better, the intensity of the mystical experience was directly related to the success of the therapy. So in a sense, we have what are virtually white-coated laboratory shamans occasioning a mystical experience in a clinical setting, merging together science and religion, which for so long have been at polar opposites. And I think this is one of the many, many fascinating aspects of the field of psychedelic studies.
Very interesting. So we'll have the pleasure to discuss about it after your talk, Jerry. So I would like to invite you to provide your talk. You'll talk around 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll have time to take all your questions. So audience, please post your questions like Louis said in the question and answers. I'll collect some of them and hopefully bring out those that are most relevant to the whole group. So, Jerry.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now.
Yes, please.
So this presentation today is based on our book, The Psychedelic Gospels. And this is co-authored by myself and my wife, co-author, editor, photographer, Julie Brown. The evidence I'm going to present to you today of mushroom images in Christian art, both Amanita muscaria and psilocybin varieties, is evidence that we collected in a 6-month journey throughout Europe. One moment, please. Okay, in this mode, I'm finding that I can't advance. Oh, there we go. So how do I get started in this particular research? Well, it grew out of my first LSD experience, which took place high in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado at a large rainbow family gathering, maybe something like an early Burning Man. And unlike Hoffman, I didn't have his kind of experience. Albert Hoffman, who took the first naive LSD trip in the world, said, "I was seized by the dreadful fear of going insane. I was taken to another world, another place, another time. Was I dying?" Well, I didn't feel I was dying, but I was spun out into a Don Juan shamanistic world of power objects and power forces. And I felt I was literally losing my mind. So being an anthropologist, I realized that, yeah, I didn't have the instant nirvana that Leary and Ramdas were talking about. And I realized that these are very powerful substances and powerful at a millionth, at a microdose, a millionth of a gram, or a few millionth of a gram. And I wanted to learn more, much more about psychedelics. Being a founding professor of anthropology at Florida International University, we founded the department, we wrote the catalog. So after that experience in 1975, I put a course on psychedelics and culture into the catalog and have been teaching it ever since. In fact, I'm teaching it again now online, but more about that later. I think it's also a fascinating aspect of psychedelic studies to look at the transformational experiences where people, researchers, scholars today that we know of today lost, their psychedelic virginity, so to speak. Groff, who had a cosmic consciousness experience in the laboratory in Prague. Michael Harner, who had a near-death experience on ayahuasca in the Amazon area among the Conibo, that had him leave the university, his prestigious position at New College, a New School for Social Research, and go off and teach shamanism. Leary, certainly, and his first mushroom psilocybin experience in Cuernavaca put him on a completely different path that in some way has affected all of us. Teaching psychedelic studies is an interdisciplinary. Anthropology in and of itself is interdisciplinary. And psychedelic studies are also interdisciplinary. They involve art history, archaeology, church theology, church history, mycology, ethnomycology. And I was learning about all these fields as I taught the class over decades. Now we fast forward to 2006, and Julie and I, on an anniversary trip, visit Roslin Chapel in Scotland, a few miles south of Edinburgh. And drawn to Roslin Chapel by the Da Vinci Code, because author Dan Brown described it as a possible resting place of the Grail. We visited Roslin Chapel, which is a Catholic church, but a unique fusion of Catholic and pagan symbolism with 100 fertility-like figures, green men, sculpted into a sinuous vine and other places around the interior of Roslin. I was particularly fascinated by this green man head that came down from the roof of the church on a stone pillar, on a stone boss. And I bought a plaster replica of this green man head. And 2 weeks later, as Julie and I were sitting in an Italian restaurant in in St. Andrews, I turned it around to the table and was looking at an Amanita muscaria mushroom. The bulbous base, the little veil, the leftover of the veil, that is the white tissue that folds back, and even the raised dots on the top of the mushroom, sculpted up and down. Paul Stamets, the world famous mycologist, when I showed him this plaster replica and these photographs, said, that is a taxonomically correct Amanita muscaria. This set Julie and my thinking ablaze. What is going on here? What is Sir William St. Clair, who founded Rosslyn Chapel in 1440, and it was completed at his death in 1480, who oversaw every arc, every sculpture, every pillar that went into Rosslyn Chapel? What is he trying to tell us? Was this a ritual practiced up here in the wilds of Scotland, far from the icy fingers of the Inquisition? Was this something that was more broadly found throughout Christian history, throughout Christian art, throughout Christendom? My goodness, could this even go back to the time of Jesus and the disciples? And now that before our minds could totally run away in a rambunctious overthrow of reason, two thoughts came to my mind. One was that of the famous astrophysicist Carl Sagan, who said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And saying that Christianity had a psychedelic history was certainly an extraordinary claim. And we would need extraordinary evidence. We wrestled with this for 6 years. It was going to be time consuming. It was going to be expensive. We could possibly find nothing. But after a while, and we've been reading and gathering and seeing other images that people had written about, we realized, and I don't know if you've come to this place in your life on certain issues or decisions, that we would regret it knowing what we know, knowing what had been given to us. As Pascal said, chance favors the prepared. And I was certainly prepared to see this, where no art historian, no theologian, no tour guide, no church historian had seen this for 500 years. Why? Because they don't study ethnobotany. So in 2012, Julie and I traveled through England, through Scotland, through England, to Canterbury, through central France, up to Hildesheim in Germany, down to the Basilica of Aquileia near Venice, to the Vatican museums, over to Eleusis in Greece, to the dark church and cave churches of Turkey, where Christians were first called Christians, and also into Israel. And here's what we found. Our first stop was a tiny chapel of plain Clairaut in the center of France. And this fresco, which is on the back of the back wall of the church, is from 1291. This fresco of the Eden scene, and literally there's two historical moments here. There's the temptation with the snake offering the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and also Adam and Eve being skeletonized have already ingested it and are covering themselves, covering their nakedness. So there are two historical moments shown here, which is not infrequent in religious Romanesque art. This image, which I believe many of you, if not all of you, have seen, if you're involved with psychedelic research or psychedelic studies, is iconic in the field. And it was at the center of the battle of the mushroom trees between ethnobotanist R. Gordon Wasson, probably the founder of modern ethnomycology, and John Marco Allegro, the scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a brilliant ancient linguist of ancient languages, who had written a book, Wasson's book Soma, in which he identified Amanita muscaria as the enigmatic plant juice god of the Hindu Rig Veda, one of the world's oldest religious texts. But Wasson said that mushrooms in Christianity ends 1,000 years before Christ. Allegro, on the other hand, said not only was there a mushroom and theogenic basis for religion, but that Christianity was essentially a mushroom cult. And he gave this image. As you can see here, that's a red and white, meticulously white spotted semi-spherical cap mushroom. Here's the snake holding out another cap. Here are several other clusters of mushroom, and here are Adam and Eve. And note that Eve is skeletonized, and in shamanism, the bones are very important because they survive the body by hundreds and hundreds of years. So Eve is already depicted, as is Adam to some extent, as having a transformational experience. Was Wasson correct? Wasson said, no, this is not a mushroom. This is a mushroom tree. In doing so, he cited a letter from June 1952, June 2nd, from Irvin Panofsky of Princeton University, one of the most famous art historians of his time, who said, this is a stylized mushroom tree, very common in Romanesque art. In fact, Panofsky said that what had happened here was that there was a transformation in art from the development of the pine tree, the pilzbaum, into a mushroom tree. However, and Julie and I went to the Wasson archives, which have all of his artifacts, all of his letters with Robert Graves, all of the documents he's collected at Harvard University Herbarium. But we also found this second letter from Panofsky 10 days later, on May 10th, it wasn't June, it was May 1952, in which he backtracks. He says, the only possibility I should be prepared to admit is that once the transformation had taken place and was generally accepted in art, some especially ignorant craftsmen may have misunderstood the finished product, the Filzbaum, as a real mushroom. And he said, well, that's not even true, because look, you have these raminations, these branches at the base. Wasson never revealed this second letter in which Panofsky said, well, there are situations where it could be a mushroom tree. Nor did Wasson reveal that he was indeed the Pope's banker. In a book of tributes to Wasson, published and edited by Thomas Riedlinger in 1977, Riedlinger interviewed Wasson's colleagues at J.P. Morgan. He was kind of curious as why would a prestigious firm such as J.P. Morgan sort of be proud of and certainly not restrict Wasson, who was a vice president of investment banking for J.P. Morgan, from working in this kind of iconoclastic area. And DeWitt Peterkin, a retired J.P. Morgan vice president, worked with Wasson, said, unbeknownst to most people, we were for many years one of the bankers for the Vatican, and Gordon used to have private audiences with the Pope. Well, here is a direct financial reason. I mean, Wasson would be under confidentiality agreements, which are very common in the investment banking field, why he might not have revealed it. But to not have revealed it, and as the preeminent authority after Allegro's career went down in flames with the publication of The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, Wasson's preeminent view prevailed and sort of quelled, if not brought to a screeching halt, investigations into entheogens in Christian art for almost half a century. For almost half a century. It's as if the leading climate denier in your country fails to reveal that they're on the payroll of ExxonMobil Oil Corporation. So here we have two pieces of evidence. And don't get me wrong, I am completely thankful to Gordon Wasson and his wife Valentina for the work they've done and for the work on Siberian reindeer herders, Maria Sabina Mazatec shaman, Eleusinian mysteries that Wasson has done. These are milestone contributions to the field. But when it comes to following the trail of his entheogenic theory of religion, past the portals of the church, into the hallowed halls of Christianity, now we start to see why Wasson, who was an indefatigable researcher, did not do this. We, Julie and I, while we praise Allegro for having the courage to talk about entheogens in religion, we differ from him in three fundamental ways. First, while Allegro denies the existence of Jesus, we are with those scholars of religious studies who believe that Jesus was an historical figure. Second, while Allegro bases his theory on speculative interpretation of ancient languages, we base our theory on the plausible and sometimes taxonomically correct identification of visual and theogenic images. And lastly, while Allegro forthrightly hoped that his writings would liberate people from the thrall of what he saw to be a false Christian orthodoxy, we hope that our discoveries will educate people about the history of psychoactive sacraments in Christianity and one day see their reintegration into Christian ritual. Giorgio Sammarini, the Italian ethnobotanist, visited Plain Corral, visited other Christian art sites, and wrote about the mushroom trees in Christianity. And he came up with a typology. The Plain Corral type, which you've seen above, the Amanita muscaria, where there is a semi-spherical foliage similar to a broad mushroom cap dotted with whited spots. There may be lateral, in this case 4 ramifications or branches that join the cap to the main trunk, these two here, I'm sorry. And around the base, there are other stems. This could be the veil of the mushroom or showing its three-dimensionality. And this, since perspective did not come in to Romanesque art or into art into the 15th century, and this is the 13th century, this could be showing a cluster of mushrooms around the base. Sammarini, in his article in Eleusis in 1998, also described what he called the Saint-Servan type mushroom tree after psilocybin images found in the Abbey of Saint-Servan, only 5 miles to the west of Plain Corral. And here we see a different kind of mushroom. It is convex. It has a downward curving cap and may be striated, striped instead of dotted, although not necessarily so. At times, this mushroom is depicted with a characteristic nipple-like shape on the top. And these are the qualities, and this is from the Christ column, a bronze 13-foot high Christ column found in the Church of St. Michael's in Hildesheim, Germany. And we'll come back to this image later. After visiting Plain Corral, Julie and I drove 2 miles east to the parish church of St. Martin de Vic in France. And here we found an incredible series of frescoes, a virtual Christology, life of Christ, with mushroom images interspersed. And here, as we entered the choir on the south choir wall, Julie grabbed my arm and pointed towards the top right-hand corner of this fresco of Jesus's entry into Jerusalem and said, "Do you see what I see?" And indeed I did. I saw 5 large, convex, tan psilocybin mushroom shapes. And one of the joyful youth welcoming Jesus to Jerusalem is holding on to that stem of the cap. We don't know what the youth is offering here. We see Jesus, we see his disciples with their arms raised up in a gesture of awe, following him. And here again is another historical moment, 700 years earlier, the purification of Isaiah's lips. But this is not as the hand of the angel comes down from separated up in heaven. This is not at the burning coal that was supposed to purify his lips. If you look closely, it's tan, it's round. It's not red like a fiery coal or black like a burning coal should be. Jesus is moving towards another wall, towards the Tower of Jerusalem. And on top of that wall, we find other youth using a long knife, in this case, to cut through the stem of the Saint Sauvin psilocybin type mushroom, or mushroom tree, if you will. And if that were not enough, this image of the towers of Jerusalem is directly over and reaches over this scene of the Last Supper. Now, this is not a Passover supper. There's no wine, there's no Paschal lamb on the table. There are the long knives, the same kind of knife that was used in cutting down the mushrooms from the towers of Jerusalem. And this is not bread, because if this were bread, it would be in loaves, and the loaves would be torn off. And these could be mushroom caps on the table as Jesus is here with his disciples, with an otherworldly expression. And this is probably Judas here. Now, I would like you to look here at the bottom of this fresco at the hems of the disciples, which you can't see very well. But when we go in closer and pull up a detail of underneath the table of the hems of the disciples, we see that the artist has cleverly drawn symmetrical mushroom caps so that we are sure to get the message. Now, at this point, Julie and I had an aha moment. We'd seen the Abbey at Saint Sauvin, we'd seen Plain Chorale, but now we saw what was evidence that spoke for itself. And as the evening light, as the dusk light came through the church windows, sort of lighting up the images, we had an aha moment. This is a psychedelic gospel. This is a secret history of the role of entheogens in Christianity. How widespread? Among an elite, among initiates in the elite, among the masses, we don't know. But we also had to step back here and ask ourselves, well, what's really going on? Is this, are these marginal priests here in central France cavorting on mushrooms in the forest, far from the control or reach of the church and the crown? We felt we needed to go to the high holy places of Christianity to see if we could find evidence in those places. And our first stop was in Canterbury, to the southeast of London, where we found the great Canterbury Psalter. A Psalter is a prayer book, and this is an illuminated prayer book with beautifully illustrated miniatures, sometimes filigreed with gold leaf. It was composed around 1200, started off in England, went through Spain, went on a long journey, ended up in the hands of Napoleon, who put the original manuscript with its bejeweled leather cover in the French National Library, where it remains today. The opening folios or pages of the great Canterbury Psalter begin with Genesis and go through the life of Jesus to his entry into Jerusalem. And here in the third miniature of the Genesis folio, we see God creating plants. However, God is not creating plants. God is creating psychoactive mushrooms. Here is a red and white Amanita muscaria mushroom with the white dots. Here is a blue psilocybin mushroom. And we know, or many of us know, that psilocin or psilocybin, the psychoactive ingredients in psilocybin mushroom varieties, when it is exposed to air, when it oxidizes, it turns blue. And over here we have a possible Paniolus psilocybin mushroom, certainly a cubensis variety. And let's look at this one here, where we have almost little holograms of mushroom shapes embedded into the mushroom cap. And in this blow up of that image, you can see that indeed that's what the artist has done. They have embedded little tiny holographic replicas of a mushroom cap into that particular image. Interestingly enough, in the very next miniature, where God creates the heavens and the earth, we find green plants growing beneath stalks of plants, green plants, spaced between the mushrooms. So the artist is telling us, look, we know what the difference, and they knew what the difference between plants and fungi was. Further on in the Great Canterbury Psalter, Jesus has now been baptized. He's out on his healing mission. And this is a fascinating scene, which we know of as Jesus heals the leper. And here are, in these miniatures, the characters speak in scrolls. And here the leper's scroll, it says, if you translate from the Latin, Master, if you will, heal me. And Jesus' scroll comes down to the back of the leper and says, I will, be cleansed. But notice that the leper's scroll is not going to Jesus, to the master, it's going to the psilocybin mushroom with the same little tiny holographs in mushroom caps embedded in it, so that the artist is showing us a direct relationship between psychoactive mushrooms in the Bible and healing. And we remember that while many Westerners turn to entheogens in search of God, for most shamanistic people, one of the main functions of entheogens was for the purpose of healing. We now went over to Chartres Cathedral in France, and there are 176 magnificent stained glass windows in Chartres Cathedral. And because of the flying buttresses, they were able to build the walls higher. So these stained glass windows, which are magnificent, are done in 2 tiers. And each of them tells a Bible story. The story of Moses, the stories of Mary Magdalene, the story of Jesus' mother, the story of the crucifixion. This one is the conversion of Saint Eustace. It's done from the early 12th century. And we start out with Placidus the hunter, very proud on his horse with his horns and his hunting stags and his assistants. And he comes to a point where he has an illumination and a religious conversion and becomes Saint Eustace. Again, as in the purification of Isaiah's lips, here we see it in color, the separation of earth, and the hand comes down from heaven, illuminating him. He is flanked by psilocybin-like mushroom caps. And here we find the cross coming up between the horns of the stag or the deer. And we know from the reindeer herder that deer and Amanita muscaria mushroom went hand in hand in reindeer herder shamanism. Giorgio Samarini has traced this image back to 5th century BC in Moroccan mosaics. And here he found the cross at that time was the mushroom. And the 2 stags were on each side, or 2 lions on each side of the mushroom. So with the coming of Christianity, the mushroom was replaced by the cross. We went on to Hildesheim, north of, I believe, Frankfurt in Germany. And here, in the other cases, look, in the case of Chartres Cathedral, we don't know who put these mushroom images into the magnificent stained glass windows. Was it the artisans who made the stained glass windows? Was it the priests who oversaw the construction and designed it? Was it the patrons of both Catholic and pagan royalty who might have financed the church? Or was it all 3 working together? But in the Church of St. Michael's in Hildesheim, we know exactly who created this entheogenic legacy. It was Bishop Bernard, the bishop of the Holy See of Hildesheim, who was a brilliant man. He was a church builder. He was a mathematician. He was a metallurgist. And in honor of the millennium, when Christ was supposed to return once again, he cast two giant bronze doors of salvation, telling the story of Eden and the fall, that went on the doors of St. Michael's. And behind the altar in St. Michael's, he put a impressive 13-foot bronze Christ column, about 3 feet in diameter, and in a helix spiraling up from the base, starting out with the baptism of Jesus by John to Jesus's entry into Jerusalem, are about 30 stories from the life of Jesus. This one is the Transfiguration, which in and of its own self is impressive because it is one of only 2 miracles that happened to Jesus in the Bible rather than were done by Jesus. And here you have Jesus standing, his disciples are by his side, biblical figures are on his left, Moses and another physical figure, and the voice comes down from the clouds of God saying, "This is my son. Hear him well. Hear ye him well." And what are the disciples standing under? 3 psilocybin, striated, nipple-capped psilocybin mushrooms. How far back does this go? We have no smoking gun for the time of Jesus and the disciples. We have no photographic evidence. We have no sculpture. In fact, there is really no datable Christian art before the year 200 because of persecution, because of poverty, because of not having churches in which, public churches in which to build this art. So we went back into the Gospels and into the Gnostic Gospels to look for textual evidence in which the speakers appeared to be describing a psychoactive experience. And here in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, which, mind you, was not authored by Thomas, Jesus says to his disciples, "Compare me to someone and tell me, whom am I like?" Thomas said to him, "Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like." Jesus said, "I am not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring, which I have measured out. He who will drink from my mouth will become like me. I shall become like he, and the things that are hidden will be revealed to him." This is amazing. We're talking about a drink. We're talking about visionary intoxication. And we're talking about a drink that is measured out. And we all know that in addition to set and setting, dose is central to the nature of a psychedelic experience. And now Jesus describes a dual unity experience that Stanislav Grof described from his 3000 LSD guided sessions, where some of the people merged into each other, where the people actually became each other. This was definitely a transcendental, mystical experience. And there are other examples in the religious literature, in the Gnostic Gospels, in the New Testament, in the Old Testament that we have found, and others are being revealed, and we invite other researchers to look as well. Now, Carl Rook, professor of classics at Boston University, offers some other images of psychedelics in Christian art to show that there are images that are completely independent of the mushroom tree discussion, that either provide a clear literal or stylized identification of mushrooms. The first is the mosaic floor, which is found at the Basilica of Aquileia, northeast of Venice. And in the oldest part of the church where Mass was said, we find this mosaic showing 9 Amanita mushrooms in a basket. And right next to that basket is a basket of snails, because the Romans, being very sophisticated with pharmaca, with drugs, and with food, and knowing that Amanita muscaria, taken some ways, could cause nausea, would let the snails eat the Amanita muscaria and then ingest the snails. Now we can go back to St. Michael's Church in Hildesheim, Germany, and this is a ceiling painting done 200 years after Bishop Benoit's death and after his sanctification by Rome. And here we find the Jesse tree on a 90-foot ceiling painting done by Bishop Benoit's monastic and churchly descendants. But this is a Jesse tree unlike any Jesse tree, which tells the lineage of Jesus from Jesse on through the house of David and others. Nowhere else in Christendom does a Jesse tree start with the Garden of Eden image. And here we have Adam and Eve against a rondel of red with gold or gold apples, and ripe Amanita muscaria turn an orangey gold image. And here we have another image showing psychoactive mushrooms at the base of Christianity and at the base of the Old Testament. Now we go to this rebus done by Jacob Boehm in his Christi Testamenta in the Netherlands in the 16th century. So we've come from the 4th century up through the 16th century. And this is fascinating because in this testament, here we find embedded in the middle of the cross is a mushroom image. And coming out of the aorta of the mushroom are grapes. And in a rebus, the message is conveyed through the artist's imagery. The message here is, I am the true vine, and the psychoactive mushroom, the juice that comes from the psychoactive mushroom, is the true vine, is the original Eucharist. I want to step back now that we've mentioned Karl Ruck, who is the most eminent living professor writing on mushroom images in ancient Greece and in early Christianity. They say there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. Karl Ruck had the misfortune to co-author an incredible work, The Road to Eleusis, unveiling the mysteries of the Eleusinian potion. And in this book, co-authored by him, Gordon Wasson, and Albert Hoffman, they described the secret potion at the base of the Eleusinian mysteries, which were practiced in ancient Greece, at the archaeological, what today is the archaeological site of Eleusis, about 7 miles west of Athens. He had the misfortune to publish this when psychedelics were not an idea whose time had come. In fact, we're in the period of President Nixon's Controlled Substances Act of 1970, banning all of these psychedelics, making them a Schedule I, no redeeming human medical value. In recent years, Ehrlichman, who you might remember, Haldeman and Ehrlichman from the Watergate trials, nearing death, made this confession. We knew, Nixon knew, we knew that these mushrooms were not dangerous, that psilocybin, that mescaline was not dangerous. We knew they weren't addictive. We had two political problems. We had a civil rights movement and we had an anti-war movement. We could not make it illegal to be Black, and we could not make it illegal in the US of A to protest. But we knew that by banning these substances and making them illegal would give us a battering ram to go into the anti-war movement, the civil rights movements, and arrest and imprison their leaders. One of the many devastating things done during the drug wars. Now, many people, and this was the time when Nixon branded Leary as the most dangerous man in America. Well, if only that was our biggest problem today. And in fact, Rick Doblin, who I believe most of you will know as the esteemed founder of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Leary said, Dobman said of Leary, there would be no second wave of psychedelics if Leary hadn't turned on a whole generation. And I agree with that. What happened during the drug wars during the 70s, we ignored the public, the researchers, the witch hunt that went on. Over 1,000 research articles with 40,000 human subjects that showed in peer-reviewed papers the beneficial effects of psychedelic drugs on addiction, on alcoholism, on depression. This all got washed away. While Wasson, as a banker, was independently wealthy, while Hoffman's career was enshrined as the father of LSD, Carl Rook was blackballed at Boston University by a very conservative president. He was no longer allowed, once this book came out, he was no longer, Road to Eleusis, he was no longer allowed to teach graduate students. Graduate students were warned that if they had him on their committee in classical languages, in Greek languages, that they would not get jobs in the field of the classics. And his courses and programs on entheogens at Boston University were terminated. Rook has labored outside of academic circles and people who study psychedelics in obscurity for nearly 40 years. But recent findings are underway to resurrecting his work and his reputation. Brian Mararescu, in a very important book called, and I've misspelled the title, it's The Immortality Key, not The Immortality Code, The Immortality Key, found new archaeological evidence showing that there was, in fact, a LSD-like ergot substance in the potion, not at Eleusis in Greece, because the head of the archaeological museum at Eleusis would not permit Brian to take samples of artifacts from Eleusis and send it to the archaeochemistry centers at MIT, at the University of Pennsylvania and Berlin, to analyze it centuries later for the possible presence of biological remains. But Brian, who is now a lawyer, an author, and also degreed in languages, Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, found the writings of a Catalonian anthropologist and archaeologist in Spain of their findings at a Greater Greece colony located in Catalonia under the name of Mas Castellar de Pontos. And based on the analysis of a human tooth and a cup, found, most importantly, in the sanctuary of Demeter and Persephone, dated from 200 to 175 before Christ. They identified in the archaeochemistry that was done with these highly sensitive gas chromatography and spectroscopy analytical machines, tools, the remains of old ergot sclerotia, claviceps purpea, which is the LSD-like substance that Albert Hoffman identified to be the kykeon of the Eleusinian mysteries, which were practiced in ancient Greece from about 1500 before the Christian era, all the way up almost 2,000 years to 400, the 5th century AD, when Christianity became the official religion of Rome and Eleusis was destroyed as a pagan site. So Eleusis, or Greater Eleusis, gives us the first scientific evidence, resurrecting Rook's career and proving that he was right all along. However, as Brian admits, There is no smoking gun, no early Christian chalice on which archaeochemical or archaeobotanical analysis can be done to prove his pagan continuity theory. And Brian has argued that since the Stone Age, since the Paleolithic era, starting some 40,000 years ago, and up until recorded time, when we have archaeological remains, 9,000 BC in what today is Algeria, the bee-headed mushroom shaman, all the way up through the grave drinking and funeral practices of ancient Turkey, all the way through the circum-Mediterranean area into Greece. And this is the practice that Brian argues in the immortality key was the pagan continuity in which psychoactive substances formed the Eucharist of early Christianity. Before we leave this is a vase found in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, Greece, of Triptolemus and Demeter from about 450, 435 BC. It is based on the Homeric hymn to Demeter. And the myth of Demeter, the story of Demeter in Greek mythology goes as follows. Hades, Demeter has a gorgeous daughter, Persephone. Hades finds her and captures her and brings her back into the underworld. Demeter goes wild and searches heavens and earth for her daughter. And she, as a goddess, speaks to Zeus, and Zeus says, well, Hades controls the underworld. I cannot bring him back. Demeter flies into a rage. She stops all things from growing. And the gods realize there will be no food. There will be nothing for humans to sacrifice to them. And Zeus makes a deal with Hades so Persephone can come back to Earth half of the year. And so we have spring and summer when she is back on Earth, and we have fall and winter when she's in the underworld. But in her wanderings, Demeter, disguised as a human, came to Eleusis. And Triptolemus, the king of Eleusis, received her, and they gave her great hospitality in her search for her daughter. And as a gift, she taught them, as reported in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, she taught them the potion secret and the rites of Eleusis. And in this vase, we see Triptolemus, king of Eleusis, bringing, and here's the line that separates the immortal from the mortal world, bringing the wheat or barley. And remember, the claviceps purpea, the ergot, grows on those sheaves of wheat and barley to Demeter, who in turn gives him back through a crack between the worlds, the sacred potion. And this is the origin of the Eleusinian rites. Now, I would like to suggest to you, as we start to move towards conclusions, that we are witnessing the birth of a second great religious reformation. And where I feel what I've said before is plausible and also at times compelling in terms of evidence of psychoactive mushrooms, of entheogens in Christianity. Here I'm going to move into a little more speculative realm. And I want to talk about two reformations. The Protestant Reformation of Martin Luther, which took place or was launched in 1517 when he nailed his 93 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany. And now, 500 years later, we're seeing the glimmerings of a new Reformation, an entheogenic Reformation launched by Hoffman and Wasson. And I put a date here of 2016, which is when the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine initiated its psilocybin studies in Baltimore, in the USA. This chart comes out of a book, The Psychedelic Future of the Mind, by Thomas Roberts, who's written a great deal on psychedelics. And here he describes, and I want to credit him for proposing this entheogenic reformation, although McKenna did speak earlier about an archaic revival. And he uses as the figureheads Gutenberg, which made the printed Bible possible, his printing press, and Wasson and Hoffman. The icon for the Protestant Reformation is the Bible, the text of the Bible. The icon for the entheogenic revolution is the Amanita muscaria mushroom. Now we're seeing religion democratized again, as it was in shamanism. We're moving from the printed word to primary spiritual experience, from reading, study, thought, to mystical experience and unity of consciousness. The spiritual knowledge under Protestantism comes from belief and doctrine and dogma and creed. Here, it is from the unmediated entheogenic perception. And here, the academic disciplines involved are philosophy and theology, and in the entheogenic Reformation, psychology and biology. Does Christianity have a psychedelic history? Julie and I believe it does, as do several other scholars, including Carl Rook and his co-author, Mark Hoffman. But we also believe there's room for it, and here we differ with Allegro, in Christianity. And Brother David Stendhal Rost of the Order of St. Benedict, a monk, said that if we can encounter God through a sunrise seen from a mountaintop, why not through a mushroom, prayerfully ingested? Now, I know it took the Catholic Church 300 years to forgive Galileo for subjecting him to the possible torture of the Inquisition so he would recant on his discoveries. We hope it won't take 300 years for the Catholic Church to acknowledge its psychedelic roots and even to integrate them back into ritual practice at sacred centers. Because why should? Because if they don't, mystical experience will now stay in the hands of the researchers, the scientists, and the clinicians. Is the time ripe for a entheogenic revolution? The demographics suggest so, in terms of what numbers of people are now religiously unaffiliated, do not belong to any particular church. Worldwide, and this is all from the Pew Research Center, it's 16%. In the US, for all ages, it's 26%. But among millennials, youth born between 1981 and 98, it goes up to 40%. And the number of people who now fit this new term spiritual, but not religious, is 27%. So I believe we are seeing the glimmerings, the emerging contours of an entheogenic religion. And when it comes to describing the emerging contours of God and religion, no one said it better than the great German language poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, in a poem from the Book of Hours called We Are Workmen. Rilke said, "We are all workmen, prentice, journeyman, or master, building you, you towering knave. And sometimes there will come to us a grave wayfarer, who like a radiance thrills the souls of all our 100 artisans, trembling as he shows us a new skill. We climb upon the rocking scaffolding, the hammers in our hands hang heavily, until our foreheads feel the caressing wing of a radiant hour that knows everything and hails from you as the wind hails from the sea. The hammer strokes sound multitudinous, and through the mountains echo blast on blast. Only at dusk we yield you up at last, and slowly your shaping contours dawn on us. Having lived and started my psychedelic experience in the 70s, Julie in the 60s, and honestly, it is through entheogens that we had our first experience of God as a divine presence that permeates the the universe, or a greater force or a greater intelligence, whatever you'd like to call that. So we've seen this, but I think that no one, and this translation is beautiful, but nothing can capture the feeling, the rhythm, the meter, and the rhyme of Rilke's own words, if you'll allow me, this last stanza here. Dan ist ein Hallen von dem vielen Hämmer, und durch die Berge geht es Stoß und Stoß. Erst wenn es dunkelt, lassen wir dich los, und deine kommenden Konturen dämmern. Gott, du bist groß. By way of conclusion of our presentation today, sorry. Christianity has a psychedelic history revealed in its artwork, in churches and cathedrals, in frescoes, in sculptures, in stained glass windows, in ceiling paintings, in mosaics, in metallurgical works. The roots of this are in Jewish and Greek mystery cults and religions. The evidence is found in early and medieval art, text, and artifacts. There are 4 levels of proof: art, literal descriptions of mushrooms, as we saw at Plain Perrault; art, stylized descriptions of mushrooms, as we saw at St. Martin de Vic; text, descriptions of mushrooms' effect, for example, Ezra's 2 in the Apocrypha, which I did not relate today, but I can; and in artifacts, the new archaeochemical analysis that Eleusis West has revealed to show that prove that there is a mushroom involved in the secret potion of the Eleusinian mysteries. I've speculated that we're witnessing the dawn of a entheogenic reformation. For future readings, I would recommend highly Brian's book, Morescu, The Immortality Key, The Secret History of the Religion No Name, which just came out. There is an article, if you don't want to read our whole book on the psychedelic gospels, our article in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, Julie and my article on entheogens in Christian art, is available online. And a marvelous book, if you want to do a deep dive into this field, is Carl Rook and Mark Hoffman's The Effluence of Deity, Alchemy, and Psychoactive Sacraments in Medieval and Christian Renaissance Art. One more thing, Henrik, and then we can open things up. If you want to follow our work, we are, our website is psychedelicgospels.com. Our Facebook page is Psychedelic Gospels. And we put a blog on another topic, psychedelic psychotherapy in Psychedelics Today. And lastly, I am teaching a course online on psychedelics and culture, fully accredited. Anyone in the world, college student, can take this, psychedelics and culture, past, present, and future, in spring of 2021. And you can email me at jbbrown@gate.net. Let me get that up there. Sorry, jbbrown@gate.net. You have any questions for me or Julie? We will answer all and each and every one of your emails. I want to thank Heinrich and the Mind Foundation, which is a magnificent organization doing great work in many aspects. We had Julie and I had hoped to get to Berlin to deliver this talk, but we all know the situation. But someday. Thank you very much.
Thank you back, Jerry, for your fascinating talk, for your journey through Europe and all the images that you looked at and interpreted. So, as you can imagine, we have a lot of questions, and I'm trying to order the questions a little bit. So let's first talk about the more science evidence, well, how is the evidence to be interpreted? Let's then maybe talk about questions or choose questions where we discuss the meaning of these findings for the current psychedelic research and practice. And then we have an open platform for questions about consciousness and everything that people ask. Yeah.
Sure.
So,
Would you like to break that down and lead that?
Yeah. So I'm just trying to choose from the questions, and let me start with a general one. So from the history of psychedelic research, we know that there is a tendency of overreach. Of course, we have to talk about what the evidence really tells us about how broadly were these practices that were depicted really practiced, were they really there, and how far does their their effect go in the whole into the whole church. So generalizing the findings, what can you tell us about that? So it could also be just one more sentence from a question that we got, that these were small marginalized groups which did not have a real influence on the development of the Christian religion. So what's your arguments for that?
On this point, because we found this evidence in the high holy places of Christianity, we agree with Carl Ruck and Mark Hoffman in many of their writings, and I cited The Effluence of Deity, that this was not suppressed. It was well known to the pagan elite who lived and married into and worked side by side in the medieval ages with the clerical hierarchy and royalty. And at very least, it was available and guiding people who were initiates, being guided by people who knew, to experience these psychoactive mushrooms as a direct portal to the divine. In other words, to not only talk about Jesus, but to literally experience Jesus, to experience heaven, to experience the immortality of the soul. And what's fascinating here, and what Johns Hopkins has shown, and Rick Doblin has shown, and the Good Friday experiment done by Walter Pankey has shown, is there is no difference between spontaneous mystical experiences as described by saints and holy men of all religions and psychoactively induced mystical experience. And in order to avoid the pejorative connotations of the word psychedelic, Carl Ruck, in a book called Persephone's Quest, redefined psychoactive substances as entheogens, generating the divine within. We believe there are 4 levels of proof here. One is where the mushroom is described so clearly that it is taxonomically evident if it's an Amanita muscaria or, say, a liberty cat, psilocybin. Then there are stylized mushrooms, then there are texts, and now we're at the dawn of having this tool of archaeochemistry. How widespread it is, I don't think we would ever know. But let me just say this. When the church moved through the Inquisition to stamp it out, and at this point, this mushroom tradition was being carried on by the wise women of Europe, who the church branded as witches and turned their horned god of shamanism into the horned devil of Satanism. The church, when it burned these heretics at the stake, it went after the mother and the daughter. Why the mother and daughter? Because it wanted to root out the tradition and knew it was being passed on from generation to generation. And the fact that there were 500,000 people burned at the stake during that time, most of them women, indicates that this tradition was spread widely and well beyond any use in Catholicism for healing, for aphrodisiacs, etc. So the short answer is We believe it was part of the church. How widespread it was, we do not know.
Some people ask, is entheogenic a good word for what you're talking about? And do we really need an entheogenic revolution? This is where you describe yourself both as an anthropologist, as an activist. So is entheogenic really what this time needs? So can you say something about your use of the terminology?
Yeah, I don't understand completely the context of the question, if it's timely to use it.
Yes. So, as a number of people ask, is entheogenic correct description, or what are we buying with the
Sure.
term entheogenic, and also your use of the word religion?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the derivation of entheogen comes first made its appearance in Persephone's Quest by Rook and Hoffman and several other authors. And they wanted to get away. This is 1978. Rook has been blackballed. Leary is the most dangerous man in America. The drug war is in full force. And they wanted to distance themselves from Leary and those of his ilk, so as Wasson described it. And they felt that psychedelic was the word that was widely used in the popular culture. So entheogen was the word. Rook, being a Greek scholar, took it from en, within, theo, deos, God, gen, within, generating the divine within, because they wanted to focus on the divine aspects of it. Obviously, this is only one aspect of the array, the varieties of psychedelic experience that Groff has described in his opus, The Way of the Psychonaut, published in 2 volumes in 1990. In 1999. So, I'm sorry, in 2019, The Way of the Psychonaut, 2019. So I think, I know that entheogen has taken root in academic circles. I prefer to use psychedelics because part of Julie and my education mission is to help destigmatize psychedelics and eventually to see them legalized to be used not only for medical purposes, but for spiritual growth, personal growth, creativity, scientific discovery, artistic embellishment at sacred centers where healthy adults would be allowed to ingest them in a safe setting with the availability of trained guides.
So in a way, thank you. In a way, just asking the questions of some of the audience. So aren't we talking also about different generations of psychedelic researchers and people who obviously also experienced these substances? So the 1960s and 70s generation was a lot about legitimizing their research, and some of the researchers drew to religion and made the arguments that you were also adding something to, so that it has been used in history. Is that really another person is asking, is that really without a downside, re-establishing a religion, a psychedelic religion? Are there downsides to that?
Okay, 2 things. First of all, there was a great variety of scientific and medical psychedelic research that went on in the 40s, seriously through the 50s and the 60s. This all got ignored. People in academia were afraid to touch it. It became impossible to get licensed to do psychedelic research under the Controlled Substance Act. I think that one of Leary's biggest mistakes was ignoring the deep shamanic cultural roots in human history of psychedelics, and which would have given it some cultural and historical authenticity, and describing it as some new mind technology. I think that was a big mistake. I think overpromising was a big mistake. I understand, having participated in the social movements of the 60s, how enticing and how part of the rebellion this was. F. Scott Fitzgerald, the novelist, said, "There's no second acts in American lives." Well, fortunately, thanks to the hard science and social science and psychological science of the psychedelic renaissance, psychedelics are getting a second life, are getting a second chance. And I believe we're doing it right this time. Yes, there is an incredible value to clinical research with psychedelics and to the emerging medical model. It is only through a well-financed medical model that these drugs will get approved and diffused. And look, there's some 300 million people in the world suffering from depression and some from treatment-resistant depression. And this is why psilocybin has been fast-tracked as a breakthrough therapy, and ecstasy for PTSD. But I also believe, personally, and for others, that this is in the US, a right, a First Amendment right of religious freedom. In Europe, a fundamental right, that this was the religion of our ancestors. And for those of us who choose to make the experience of psychedelics the foundation of our religious belief today, and I'm one of those, we should have that right, cognitive freedom. And people should also have the right to explore it outside of a religious context. It's been used by Fadiman and Harmon for scientific breakthroughs at Stanford. So I believe there's a place for the medical model, for the decriminalization model that's going on, and also for religious exploration. It's a big tent.
Somebody is diving into your statements about some shamanism, and the question is, was the original shamanic tradition really democratic? Wasn't it just the shaman who imbibed the substances and visited the spirit world?
It depends. Among reindeer herder shamanism of Siberia, and there's about 30 reindeer herding tribes left today, who are considered to be the fathers of shamanism, that because they were the ones who traveled across the Bering Strait ice age, the ice age landmass of the Bering Strait, and brought entheogens into the New World. That's a whole story, and I don't want to go down that road unless people want me to. But there is age-old shamanism going on there with mushrooms, also found in petroglyphs on the sides of rivers, 1,000 years old, near the Arctic Circle. In that form of shamanism, remember, shamanism was worldwide religion without any centralized church of our ancestors, obviously at least spontaneously created after the discovery of psychedelics, maybe culturally diffused among neighbors in some cases. To answer specifically the question, among the Siberian reindeer herders, only the shaman originally takes the potion. But it has also been documented that he can come down from his climbing up the tree after ingesting the entheogen and urinate, and the other people in his tribe will hold out cups, drink the urine, and have a psychedelic experience. Why? Because, as Wasson pointed out in Soma, unlike most other psychedelics, the ibotenic acid and muscarine and muscimol in Amanita muscaria is not metabolized well by the body. So a person can get high by drinking the urine of someone who drank that. In Mazatec shamanism, Maria Sabina, she would take the mushrooms, the landslide mushrooms, and the ill person, or the person who wanted an answer, would also take it. And together, she would divine, with them in that state of mind, she would divine a healing answer for them. Not all shamanism is psychedelic based, and there are varieties of the ways that shamans use it.
A question concerning the urine form of ingestion that you just described. Would you interpret the bubbling spring in one of your sources, the bubbling spring that Jesus has claimed to have become, as drinking the urine of the Amanita consumer?
He said, that has been measured forth from my mouth. That is a wild stretch of the imagination. And I think there's two things that we have to avoid in this, very controversial area. Not seeing mushrooms anywhere, because we just have denied fundamentally that they can be there, or seeing mushrooms and mushroom effects everywhere.
That's the
This
over
is
we were
this
starting.
is something John Rush does in his book, where, well, there are many things, halos and blood, they're symbols of mushroom. In other words, almost anything can be a mushroom, and that undermines the more rigorous field of study.
Yeah. Some are asking what are the possible artifacts we should look for in order to further develop or prove this hypothesis of use of psychedelics.
Yeah, I think that
evidence coming up.
yes, I think the following, that look, the dam broke after our research and the research of Carl Rook and the research of John Rush and the Grecian and the research of Irvin and others on documenting, going all the way back to Allegro, mushrooms, one, as the origins of religion, in Watson's case of all religion, and number two, mushrooms in Christian art. So we just have a handful, maybe several dozens of compelling images of entheogens in Christian art. What those of us who are interested in this topic need to do is we need to become psychedelic detectives. Julie and I found out that our book is being translated into Russian and will appear in Russian by a mycologist couple are publishing it next year. But at the end of the preface we wrote to that book, I said, look, who knows what mushroom treasures are to be found in the Hermitage, the incredibly vast collection of Russian art, in Russian Orthodox Church icons, and among the rock art or cave art of the reindeer herders. And this goes for the Middle East, this goes for Northern Africa, this goes throughout Christendom. This is the tip of the iceberg. So we need to build up a compelling amount of evidence. We need to look at when artists are depicting it in Renaissance and medieval art and understand the history and the art history. And art history historians have failed because they don't understand mycology. As one said to me, I wouldn't know a mushroom if I saw one. And also the new archaeological evidence. Brian, being a Catholic, was granted access to areas of the Vatican that very few people, the Vatican Inquisition records. Would we ever be able to go into the archaeological remains of Eleusis in Greece, or the archaeological remains of the catacombs, or the places where early Christian and the bones and areas of the relics of early Christian saints, and be able to test them for the presence of mushrooms or other entheogens? That would be the smoking gun in this field, the compelling proof.
Jerry, let's jump from history to the future. So a colleague of mine who is also part of the psilocybin depression study that will be starting in Germany soon, he is asking the following question. As psychedelics will likely be further popularized in the coming years, Western societies will be confronted with the need to provide growing numbers of people who will have psychedelic-induced mystical type experiences with tools of integration. So now many in the psychedelic field, he says, believe that philosophy and contemplative practices, mindfulness practices, serve this need. But in your opinion, now that's a question, in your opinion, does the Christian religion itself have anything to offer for integration? Or, yeah, that's basically the question. Does the Christian tradition itself have something?
Yeah, in his book called God, A Story of Revelation, the best-selling author Deepak Chopra talks about 4 pathways to God. One of those is meditation. Another of those is lifetime of service. Another is immersing oneself, as Rumi did, the poet Rumi, in the passion and burning love of God. And another is through contemplation. So I don't think any responsible person would claim that psychedelics are the only way to mystical experience or divine experience. Certainly, they are a super highway to the unconscious. So I say that there are many pathways. This is one spoke on the wheel. But what is amazing to Julie and me, having worked in this area for, my goodness, almost half a century, is to see how deep, broad, sophisticated, and widespread the psychedelic research and the psychedelic use movement is today. Temple attendance is declining. Church attendance in mainstream Catholic and Protestant churches is declining. And I think that if, as Brother David Steindl-Rast says, there's no irreconcilable theological difference or barrier to saying that mushrooms, one of God's creations, could give us a divine experience. And whether the church at some point, and I know there are some mushroom churches springing up around the world, whether the Catholic Church will eventually realize, hey, this is our authentic roots. We're not going to give this away to the New Age movement. Let's take this back in-house. And like Maria Sabina and like ayahuasca, where the Council of Bishops of Brazil have approved ayahuasca use in Santo Dime, which is a Catholic practice, that it can be part of a Catholic tradition. And I would love to see that.
I'm combining two or three questions. So some people are concerned about what they also see. This is esotericism, this is conspiracy theories, blooming in the psychedelic field, this is irrationalism. So what's your attitude towards that? Do these practices have a tendency to increase these phenomena?
I think in general, the research shows that the people who do psychedelics have a deeper sense, as Hoffman did, for the environment, a deeper sense that we are all one, which is what mystical experience teaches us. If we can get beyond this prison of the ego and realize that we are all leaves on the same tree of life, which Julie did in her mystical experience, which is on a video of that on our website, a video of her talking about that on our website. So I think that's there. However, we must recall that in addition to the doors of perception, Aldous Huxley wrote Heaven and Hell. And if you are going into a psychedelic experience with a fragile frame of mind, a fragile ego, in emotional turmoil, as I was on my first psychedelic experience, you can become paranoid, which I did in my first experience. You can become lost. You can become your mind. I mean, look, the CIA in the United States in the 50s invested the LSD as a truth serum. And they also used it, can we influence the minds of people? Because it made people hyper suggestible. So all of that is there. I think what the clinical model is showing, there are safe, responsible, and highly predictable ways to use psychedelics that will have a beneficial outcome. In Griffith's case at Johns Hopkins, 70% positive outcome in one or two sessions. So are there going to be these other things? Yes, they're all going to be there. And I think our responsibility is to engage the conversation, to identify, call out, and remove bad actors who use psychedelics to power trip or do harm or sexually take advantage of people in their care. And also to have, forward a responsible conversation. But it's free speech, and you're going to find all kinds of themes going up. But the main research shows that there are positive, life-changing, and long-term benefits for most people who use psychedelics.
Let's close with a personal question of mine, because we started with Victor Turner, and I was doing that with a purpose, Victor Turner, yeah? So he was doing his research about ritual, and as you mentioned yourself, talking about people reaching states of liminality, But this was analysis of traditional societies. Now in modern societies, we don't have rituals. We even don't have authorities who carry these rituals. No shamans, or if we do, we have 12 and not one. So my last question to you, building on this analysis or this description, is, do you think it's more important to build places and settings, and if you want to call it rituals, or is it more important that people have the experience?
To be honest, and I don't think it's politically correct these days because everyone wants to talk about guided sessions, but from my own personal experience, well, let me say this. At the beginning of a book called Acid Dreams, which is the whole story of the 1960s, the authors start out and they talk about this gathering at Santa Cruz College, Santa Cruz, of the veterans of the, Allen Ginsberg was there, and Leary was there, and John Lilly was there, and everybody was trying to say, this is the way you should take psychedelics. You should use the Tibetan Book of the Dead. You should follow this tribal indigenous ritual practice. And both Lilly and Ginsberg got up at the end and said, don't listen to anyone, follow your own path. And while it is very much, and I think importantly, said that you should have guided sessions with integration, I, for one, and Julie as well, when we started with psychedelics, as so many of our generation, we had no idea what doses we were getting. We had no one to guide us. We didn't know what to expect, and there were certainly no integration circles online or anywhere to plug into. And I had some of my most profound experiences out in nature, as did, by the way, Albert Hoffman, as he relates in the Swiss countryside in his book, LSD, My Problem Child. That said, I think for bringing this out into the general audiences, it's very important to create rituals, whether it be in retreat centers, whether it be at mass gatherings, liminal gatherings, such as Burning Man in the United States, or the Boom Festival in Portugal, both of which got deferred because of COVID. So rituals are being created, and are being created in these ayahuasca and psilocybin truffle centers in the Netherlands. And out of that will emerge, I believe, a new liminality, so to speak, a new structure of ritual, as Victor Turner would describe it, in which hopefully we prepare ourselves, we go into the liminal state, we have elders and guides available, and we can come back wiser, better for it.
So thank you, Jerry. Thank you to the audience. So we'll send a number of links to you after this talk of Jerry, where you can relate to him, where you can find his books. And so at the end of this fascinating historical and anthropological talk, we'd like to point you to some further events that we have in the Mind Academy. Maybe Louis, can you show the next?
Yes. Thank you, Jerry, for such an amazing talk. It's been really interesting to share this moment with you. And I would like to share my screen with all the attendees. Thank you for staying until the end. We have an upcoming event next week, and we would love it if you could be here with us again.
No, as some of you might have, some of you who follow us closely might have realized, we haven't talked and we have discussed a lot about Jungian perspective, Jungian psychology in the last 2 years. And we are starting to do that from a very different point of view. So Stephen Asma is a renowned researcher, interesting discussant, professor of philosophy at Columbia College Chicago. And he is looking at the evolution of imagination and what role it had and it has in our becoming humans. So how does that link to Jungian thought and Jungian psychology? Of course, Ziggy Jung opened up a lot of the excess to the images and to the cultural depiction of inner images. And so we'd be happy to meet many of you again next week, December the 11th at 7:30. So goodbye to everybody. Goodbye, Jerry. And
Bye-bye. Thank you.
yeah,
Thank
bye.
you, everyone.